Hi, everybody. This is Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week, our guest is Kat Jutras. She's the State Advocacy Director for Death Penalty Alternatives for Arizona. Her organization focuses on the death penalty abolition and issues related to criminal justice system in Arizona. You can visit them on the web, and there will be notes with directions to do so. In the meantime, let's meet Kat. Kat, welcome to the show.
Hi, Mike. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on. We've only had one other real death penalty type guest before, and it was Kirk Nurmi. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he is now a friend of the show, and so I'm excited to ask you more questions about just how death, as our topic of the show, relates to the justice system. And before we start, we always ask our guests, just so that our listeners can orient themselves. How old are you? Where did you grow up? And what generation, if any, do you consider yourself a member of?
Well, I grew up in Arizona. I'm originally from Honduras, so I consider both home, but Arizona is where I went to school, where my parents raised me. I kind of feel like I belong to two different generations just because I had a really unique upbringing. My parents were significantly older when I was adopted. My dad is part of the silent generation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so both my parents were essentially retired when I was adopted. So I grew up listening to vinyl before it was cool, because that's what they had. Spent a lot of time in RVs, traveling as a kid. But I'm technically part of the millennial generation, but definitely can translate across both if needed, just because of that really unique upbringing.
Wow. And I'm sorry if I missed it. How old are you again?
I'm 33.
Okay, 33. That is so fascinating. I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to any of our shows, but I am in love with culture. I taught ESL for 12 years, so everything you just said would be what I would normally focus the entire podcast on now. So that's a bit of a curveball I was not expecting. I will just say the following. I used to be hired to do accent reduction and everything, and it's incredible that you have absolutely no accent whatsoever. Are you fluent in Spanish, I'm assuming?
I'm not. My Spanish is really terrible. I actually took French in high school, and that's been really helpful in Arizona.
Yeah. Wow, that's cool. That's really interesting. Do you feel like if other people your age, I'm 43, so I'm 10 years older than you, if other people your age and maybe even my age had spent time with anyone from the silent generation, that we would have a different and perhaps better perspective on the calamity that we consider to be going on right now?
Yes, because I think all of us, myself included, are very soft when it comes to what we deal with. Yes, there are significantly more stresses, but they're almost self-induced when it comes to technology and social media and consumerism, capitalism. All these things just seem so hyped up because everything is so accessible. Information is so accessible. My parents, uh, technology and all of that, even with my aunt now, who was born in the 40s, feels very different about things than I do. Politically, socially, technology wise, she can send emails, she can't text. So I would definitely say their viewpoint on things is very different, but their concerns were significantly different. I'd say some of the things affordable food is still an issue. That's the same as it was back then as it is now for a lot of people. There's at least my parents thoughts on war was it was a necessary objective, and that comes from them also being in the military and my dad being combat during Korea and Vietnam. So very, very, very different patriotism levels, very different just viewpoints on things. Both my parents are now deceased, but I grew up very indoctrinated. We had a picture of Ronald Reagan in our house, like
Yeah.
that, guns everywhere, military stuff, hung up, a shrine to hunting, like that was the home environment for me,
Hmm.
for like my childhood. So like very different than going over to my friend's house who, like have live, laugh, love on the wall, and
Hmm.
very, very different.
Yeah, wow. And just from my audience perspective, in case they aren't familiar with the term the silent generation, like I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joe Biden would be considered a member of that, right? Like he's on the tail end of it. Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, he's on the tail end. It's like folks from like who were born in the 20s.
Yeah, okay. It's wow. I one more question on the subject because it hits home. I had a first marriage and I had a wonderful son in that marriage when I was like 33, 34. And at that point I was like, oh, I'm kind of an old dad because like in my generation, most people had children around 25, I would say. Then I remarried and I've had two kids in my 40s. So I just had my final kid, and I'm saying that with like, certainty. Um, and so she's 8 months old. So I had her when I was like 42, almost 43. I sometimes wonder if my kids are gonna like notice that I'm much older than like other parents of other kids, and how much that's going to affect them and stuff. I'm just curious, did that ever happen to you? Is that a real phenomenon, or does it not matter?
Absolutely. I hate to give you the bad news
No,
on
no, it's
this,
fine. Yeah, yeah.
but I actually don't think it's like totally bad news, and I think it has to do more with like aging now is very different. Like someone who was like 40 in my mind, like I think of Home Alone, and that was like my gauge of like how old people were.
Yeah,
As a kid, I'm like, man, his parents are old. No, his mom was like 30 something in that movie.
yeah,
When I look at someone who's 30 something, like I'm 30 something now, I'm like, am I old? Like, what is that now? I wear Vans, they have orthotics in them, but um, no, I definitely feel like it was very different for me, because like when I went to elementary school, they'd be like, your grandma's here to pick you up. And I'm
hmm,
like, oh, that's my mom. Or your grandpa's here. Like kids just were not used to seeing older people other than their grandparents. And my parents, like I don't think there were lots of like skincare options.
yeah,
Like I'm sure there was lead paint in the walls. Like my dad flew off like some of the first planes in the
yeah,
Navy. So like what do you think their exposure was
yeah,
to toxic fumes and paint and like things that I'm like I just know that that has a lot to do with like how age is viewed to kids.
hmm,
Also like clothes, like I'm sure your parents dress very different than my parents
hmm,
did. My mom and dad were wearing like Velcro shoes,
yeah,
like now at this, I look at like 50, 60 year olds, and like some of them are really stylish and cool.
yeah,
I look forward to being that age. So I would say like it is so based off of what like how you dress, how you respond, how you're keeping up with kind of the rest of society.
hmm,
And like, one of the other parents, like it comes down to even like, what are you watching on TV?
wow,
What movies are you watching? What music are you watching? What shoes are people wearing? Like for some reason, those are the things that I feel like as a kid, I was hyper focused on that stuff because like my parents were so different.
hmm. And so did that start like a preoccupation, and not necessarily in a bad way, but just the actual definition, a preoccupation with death? Like, were you aware, like, oh, my time with my parents might be less than others, or is that not related?
No, I think it definitely has, and I'm sure like my therapist loves to pick this apart. Is that like I have been surrounded by death most of my life,
Hmm.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
But it did like force me to grow up and have very different perspectives on life and life goals, and really what does like a fulfilling life look like. Um, my grandma, traveled all over the world, and like this is when you could,
Hmm. Yeah.
affordably. My parents like were very, very comfortable in their life and retirement. But my dad died when I was like 8 years old. So I like immediately had a lot of exposure to grief and loss and illness. And then like as I got older, I kind of took on this caregiver role for my parents, even my uncle who like passed away at like 85, 86
Hmm.
a few years ago. So like these moments definitely I think like have made me value life in a very different way.
Hmm.
My fiance, both his parents are still alive. They're in their 70s. He hasn't like fortunately hasn't had to deal with any significant like losses of death other than his grandparents.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so to hang on to your parents so long, I'm like, do not mourn the living.
Hmm.
Appreciate them while they are here. Spend the time with them while you can. Take that extra moment to, like give them a call. I think there's too much grief around like death in a certain aspect when you can savor all this time that you have with the living.
That is great. Thank you for sharing that with me. I'm going through a lot of that right now, and you just actually gave me a sentence I can cling to and actually use practically in my life. So if you did nothing else today, consider yourself successful in this podcaster's life. Well, that was a good transition, I think, into the death penalty and why you're working with this advocacy group, Death Penalty Alternatives for Arizona. I think the best way to do this would just be to have you, in your own words, as an expert, as briefly as you can, just explain the history of the death penalty in America, meaning like just to catch our audience up, like why do we have it jurisprudentially speaking and all that, in your opinion.
Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks.
Well, I'll try to encapsulate this as quickly as I can with like the major points. So the United States didn't have the death penalty back in 1976. There was the Supreme Court had ruled that there was a constitutional issue with it being applied in pretty much every state. So in 1976, we got rid of the death penalty universally in America.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like, okay, so why do we have it now?
Yeah.
Well, every state, it was like, okay, we need to amend this language. And then that kind of bypassed what the Supreme Court had said. So slowly after, I think 1978, states started to change their laws so that they could have the death penalty again. I think a huge reason why we haven't is because America really likes brutality and revenge. I think like those are truly some of the two most common reasons why we have it.
Yeah.
We have a system that is really hell bent on retribution. We've got tons of people in prisons for nonviolent crimes out of what? Because they broke the law. I look at all of the folks that I work with, both the men and women who are on death row here, and can only see the failures in the system of like, where did this retribution go? Because it started long before they got to kind of their permanent residency on death row. It started as children within like a punitive juvenile system. And kind of escalates from there. The lack of social services and the way corrections operates is not really bent on rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
So there is kind of, I think, this deep-seated issue with the death penalty, and it really is a perfect example of systemic failures within how the justice system works, the juvenile system works, the foster care system. All of these systems are kind of underneath this like iceberg that you get to the top, and that's where death row is. But I would generally say there's a lot of reasons why we have it beyond just like retribution.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's fallacies within how the law is applied. Honestly, in Arizona specifically, and a lot of other states, it comes down to a financial thing with the counties. So, like in Maricopa County, which is the largest county, most populated county in Arizona, 75% of death sentences come out of that county. I live in this county, so I'm gonna say my county.
Yeah, mine
and
too. So just
but does that mean that murders don't happen everywhere else? No, murders happen all over the state. So why is it that 75% of them have, like, all the death sentences come out of Maricopa? Well, it's because Maricopa has the most money for capital trials. It costs millions of dollars for a capital trial. And if you are in a small rural county like Greenlee or Mojave or even Yuma, there's not street lights on every street, like there are pressing needs where that money has to be reinvested. So it really comes down to money at the end of the day. And I think a lot of clout that comes with the corrections are on prosecutors of where they're wanting to have a capital case on their resume. It's kind of like a gold star for prosecutors, as if you can get a death penalty case, because it comes with, years of experience. But there's a lot of systemic racism. There's a lot of poverty in capital cases. You don't see rich people who commit homicides on death row. You don't see a lot of, I'd say, mentally healthy people in that space.
Wow, that's profound. Yeah.
78% of the people on Arizona's death row have had some documented historical mental illness. So this is not a place where, people who committed a homicide and it was horrific end up. This is where the poor, the sick, the mentally ill end up in our system. And more often not, it really comes down to almost a game of chance when you're thinking about how juries work.
Yeah.
So if most people's context to how I'd say the court system works comes from what they see on TV and movies. Civics classes are not so great these days. I certainly don't remember mine. When I started in this work, I was like, oh my God, none of this was in the book. But we certainly know a lot about the Alamo. But nothing about like our correction system or court system. And a lot of that I think is like really, it's not a conspiracy theory, but it is, I think, in a way to keep us all very ignorant of how complicated it is. These cases take years to get to trial. Some of them are 7-8 years before they even start. And then decades after they've completed in the appeals. So what, is very much told to you like on court TV or like I forget the name of the guy you mentioned before, but I recognized him as Jodi Arias' counsel.
Correct.
It took years for her to get to trial, and that could have been potentially a capital case. It didn't end up that way, but I mean, I know for a fact Jodi is working in the library in Lumley on a maximum security unit. Meanwhile, she was convicted and found guilty of killing Travis Alexander, I think. Meanwhile, there is a woman who is on death row right now who is convicted of felony murder. So she didn't actually pull the trigger in the case and is waiting for appeals on a death sentence. So there are significant differences in sentencing when it comes to people who've actually physically committed a heinous and horrific crime, and also people who get charged with, let's say, felony murder and get a death sentence who didn't actually physically cause the death. Shocking, right?
Wow. I said before the podcast when we were speaking, I wasn't going to say my stance, but I think to my audience it's going to be more than obvious. I'm very, very, very against the death penalty. I do not care. Yes, I have children. Yes, if someone murdered my children in front of me, I still would not advocate the death penalty. How do I know that? I don't. But I just feel like everything you said is a great reason to be against it. But I also feel a moral compulsion to not play God and not make judgments. With that said, I'm not dumb. I know that there are some people who not only don't consider rehabilitation possible for themselves, but they also show, if anything, a lack of interest in that. And recidivism is what it is, and there's all sorts of issues with the rehabilitation system. So what do you tell people specifically with people who molest children and just these heinous, in your words, villains of our society? How do you talk to people when they say, come on, there's no hope for these people? What do you suggest we do with specifically that narrow but actual population?
Yeah, it's definitely a question that I get quite often in this line of work, and I have no problem disclosing I wasn't always an abolitionist. I like I said, I grew up with very conservative parents in a very conservative neighborhood where there was no crime. It was very safe, but we all kind of grew up with these if something like this happened, the court system wouldn't have a problem because my dad or my mom would have taken care of it. There would be street justice.
Wow.
And that's the mentality they definitely came with. And for a long time, I'm like, you know what? These people are bad people.
Mm-hmm.
It really wasn't until I started looking at these cases individually and stopped painting people with this really broad paint roller
Mm-hmm.
of they're evil, they're bad, they're the scum of the earth. That's just not the case.
Mm-hmm.
And for these cases that are, extremely vile, despicable crimes against children, that is such a narrow population of the row.
Mm-hmm.
There are many, many, many other convictions of people who have committed those crimes against children who are not on death row.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say that these people don't deserve punishment. I absolutely think they should have some consequences, but there also comes accountability and willingness to want to improve your life and learn from this lesson, even if it means that your life is going to be in a hellscape, which I truly believe incarceration is.
Me too. Wow.
Having removal of any choice for the rest of your life, when you can eat, when you can sleep, how you get dressed, what you can wear. It is the ultimate controlled environment that we don't even subjugate animals to in the pound. There definitely is, I think, a scope of hell. If there is a place, it is in a prison that I could equate to hell. And that's where most of these people are going to die. I also don't like to paint every single person as guilty because there was a study done probably, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago that reviewed cases with a potential risk of 4 to 6% people on death row as potentially innocent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can you tell me, let's say there's 100 people, there's 111 right now on death row. Could you pick out the 4 innocent ones? Because I certainly can't.
Yeah.
If we have any doubt as people, as humans who have morality, have a common sense of what justice should be, can we pick one and say that one's innocent and that one isn't? I've had the opportunity to meet several people who have been exonerated from death row. One of them is the co-founder for Witness to Innocence. It's a national organization that is led by people who survived death row. They had wrongful convictions, and are now, speaking from their personal lived experience of surviving. Ray Crone here in Arizona did 10 years in prison, several years on death row before being exonerated. Ray was a honorably discharged veteran. He was working for the Postal Service. He had a house, a dog, never been in trouble a day in his life. And then a homicide happens at a bar that he frequents. And the killer in the case had bitten a part of the victim's body. And somehow Ray was attached to this possible suspect list. The teeth imprints that they took from him allegedly, matched. And this is junk science now. This has been proven junk science. Teeth imprints are not credible evidence. And Ray was essentially convicted on circumstantial evidence. They could have killed Ray. Deborah Moki, her son was killed. Her son Christopher was murdered. And Deborah did 22 years total on death row. They absolutely could have killed Deborah. I mean, Barry Jones, like 2 summers ago, walked off of death row after almost 30 years. These are not fake people. These are people here in Arizona. This happens frequently, nationally.
It's fascinating because I'm trying to think of like when all of this came crashing down on me. I know I'm an author and I wrote, my favorite book I ever wrote was about the prison system, and it's the research I did on it was so scary and evocative and just awful that like I cringe even as you describe it, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, including the person who murdered my children. Like that's the best way I could explain it. So it's weird because I'm not even just against the death penalty, I'm sort of against incarceration. But to be fair, especially to people in my audience listening, I do see like what you said, like we need accountability and punishment, and especially with people who are not seeking accountability and won't, which I do believe is a thing. I don't know where to put these people and what to do with them, but I do know that all of this just feels really wrong. I am curious because the point of the show is to ask people what they think happens when you die. And I wanted to ask it to you before you gave all your opinions, but then I thought about it before we recorded, and I decided to ask you at the very end of the interview because I wanted people just to hear what you had to say, and then I'm just curious how it may or may not tie into your belief system. So what do you think does happen to each of us when we die?
That's a great question. I spent a long time thinking about it just because, like, again, very early exposure to death, like, shapes your perspective. My parents were also atheists. So, like, my mom was just, like, very real. She's like, the worms eat you and you die.
Wow.
And I'm like, oh my God, they're eating my dad. Like, that was, like, the horror I dealt with as a child. Like, again, they came from a generation of just like, it hurts to live, and you're just gonna feel it.
Yeah.
Very like tough people. I really believe that our energy goes somewhere. I don't know where it goes. I don't think we haunt places, although I absolutely love the paranormal. So I like to dream of that being an option. But like truly the perspective that I have now over the last few years has radically shifted because of the population that I work with. I have really wonderful relationships with some of the men and women. I hear their hopes and dreams. I hear their, like we write back and forth to each other on different books and film, and I'm really able to see their humanity and their understanding. And I have, I still hold some atheist value. I'm probably closer to agnostic these days, maybe more spiritual minded. But when you have men pray for you and the health of your family who are waiting to die, it radically changes what you hope happens. And I certainly have hope that like they will be free in a different way one day. I don't think anyone deserves to burn in hell for what they've done or any kind of approach to that aspect of religion. I think it's really, really hard to live. And we all face such enormous challenges in life. Everyone, I think, has a particular burden that they have to carry, whether that's mental, physical, or just an experience that you never let go of. I do think that we potentially reincarnate in some way. Our energy has to go nowhere, and that like basic principle of physics that like somehow I retained in high school is that like energy is neither created nor destroyed. So I'm like, okay, thank you. Honors physics for that one little tidbit that I hold on to, but I think we go somewhere. I don't know where that is. I certainly hope it's not space because it's scary. But I think we stay here somewhere.
It's a great answer, and it was really captivating. And I think what you said about like people who we label overtly as scum or like praying for you and your family and stuff, I think that I hope people really consider that, because I've seen that myself, and it's weird. I was just reading about Truman Capote and his work for In Cold Blood, and one of the reasons that book was possible is that every criminal that he interviewed for that book, and every criminal he interviewed after and before, because he was famous for interviewing the down and out, they trusted him because they could tell he wasn't judging them. It wasn't that he loved them, but he just wasn't willing to say you're scum. And I think that that's a good step we all could take. So no, I don't think there's anything weird about your perspectives, and I loved your sense of humor, and I think that you're the perfect person to be on this death penalty alternatives for Arizona, because it's important that people are practical and realistic when talking about this issue. I don't like when some Instagram influencer is just kind of saying like something about the death penalty. I think it weakens what you're trying to say, which is about humanity and people and individuals, and not just overt systematic solutions. So thank you so much, Kat, for coming on the show. Is there anything you'd like to add before we go?
No, I mean, the only thing I would add is that we all need to be kinder to each other. And a lot of the cases that I've read that really showed me how this person became this way. Because like I think that's one thing in this, like if you're interested in criminal cases or homicides, you always want to know why. Why did this happen? And in almost every single case that I've read over the last few years in this work in particular, there was always one opportunity for someone to do something kind, to be that intervention for this person. It could have been when they were a child. It could have been when they were a young adult. It could have been when they were a whole grown person. That just didn't happen. And from that moment, there kind of became only one path for this person to see. So if you can be one thing for someone, it doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be somebody you know. Just that one little intervention to take on a daily basis if you have encounters with people.
Well, it's perfect, and it's definitely the moral of the show and kind of what I'm trying to do with my life. And there's definitely less crime when people don't feel like no one cares about them. So thank you again, Kat, for coming on the show. Please check out www.azdeathpenalty.org for more information on how you can help death penalty alternatives for Arizona. And as always, if you want to support this show, please head over to mikeyop.com. That's MIKEYOPP.com, and subscribe so I can reach your inbox once a week with philosophical and humorous essays. Thank you again, Kat, and thank you to everyone for listening. My name is Mike Oppenheim. This has been another episode of Coffin Talk, and we will see you soon.